Hi there, this is Tony from pianotone.ca, and this is going to be a shootout video between two super cool organ-focused stage keyboards, both of which I currently own, and both of which I do really like. The Yamaha YC-61 and the Viscount Legend 1 73 key version. These two keyboards are currently priced about the same at around $2,000 US. It should be noted, though, that the 61 key version of the Legend 1, which is identical to the 73 key version, other than the number of keys and also the key action, is about $200 less than the Yamaha YC-61. Now, I have already done very detailed in-depth reviews on both of these keyboards, so this video isn't going to deep dive into a lot of nitpicky details. Mostly what I want to cover here is what I think are the main pros and cons of each keyboard in hopes of helping you decide between these two in case you're not sure which one might meet your needs better. If you do want to deep dive further into either of these keyboards, I have links to my full reviews on them in the description below. So let's check it out. Okay, so the first main difference, the key action. The action on the Yamaha YC-61 is a semi-weighted waterfall key action, which is the type of action you're usually going to find on keyboards where playing organ is a big focus. In case you're not familiar with what waterfall means, it means that there is no lip sticking out over the front edge of the key like there is on a traditional piano action. And the front corners are also usually slightly rounded as well. This makes organ techniques like organ smears nice and smooth, easy and comfortable to do. And the fact that it is semi-weighted does help with playing piano or electric piano pieces expressively and with a little bit more control than you're going to get on a totally non-weighted synth action key bed. And while I do like how the action on the Yamaha YC-61 feels, especially for organ, I do have one main issue with the YC-61's key bed, and that is that the keys are slightly narrower. The YC-61 has an octave width of about 159 millimeters, which is a typical synth action octave width, as opposed to a true full-size octave width of about 164 millimeters, which is what you're going to find on most digital pianos. Now, this is something that you might or might not notice, and you might or might not care about. I've asked other reviewers and some super talented pro players what they think about the octave width difference, and I've been told that they didn't even notice and it doesn't affect their play at all. I've also seen a number of people comment online that they struggle with going back and forth between the 159 millimeter and 164 millimeter octave widths, and I've got to admit I fall into that category. I find I can get myself used to the narrow octave width if I play nothing but that width, but then it takes me a little bit of adjustment to get used to the 164 millimeter width again when I go to play one of my digital pianos, and vice versa. Could just be the fact that I'm still a relative beginner, but it is something that I do notice and struggle with. But octave width aside, I do like how the action feels on the YC-61, especially for organ pieces. So keep in mind that the key bed and action on the 73 key version of the Legend 1 is different than the 61 key version of the Legend 1. It's a 73 key version that I own and that I'm about to talk about. The 73 key has a semi-weighted Fatar TP8 piano action. So while the key weight feels similar to the YC-61, the keys are not waterfall. They are piano shaped and they do have that lip on the front edge of the key. However, unlike the Yamaha, these keys are a true full-size octave width of 164 millimeters, so that's awesome. But it doesn't stop there. The Legend 1 keys are also significantly longer than the keys on the YC-61. The YC-61's white keys are about 140 millimeters long, but the Legend 1s are 148 millimeters long, which matches the key size on most fully weighted digital pianos, including my Yamaha DGX 670. Now, I don't know if this is because a longer key has a better placed pivot point or something, but all I can say is between the full-size octave width and the longer keys, playing piano and electric piano pieces on the Viscount Legend 173 feels far more natural and familiar than it does on the YC-61. I still consider myself a beginner, but I immediately noticed how much more control I have over my dynamics when playing piano on the Legend 1 than on the YC-61. But what about the organ action? Well, that's something that really surprised me on the Legend 1. Even with the piano-shaped keys, playing organ also feels very natural, smooth, and easy. Even palm smears and percussive playing are surprisingly comfortable on this action. I actually shouldn't be that surprised because this Fatar TP8 piano action is a more premium version of the action, which is the Fatar TP9 piano action that is found on my previous Studio Logic Numa Compact 2X, which also felt natural for organ playing, but the Legend 1's is noticeably better. So purely for organ playing, if I was to pretend that I didn't mind the narrower keys on the YC-61, Would I prefer the YC's action over the Legend 173 for playing organ? Well, maybe, but Viscount recently released their first firmware update, which is really fast, by the way. And part of that update included an option to have a higher trigger point for organ voices. So basically, less key travel is required to trigger a sound. If you compare the key travel needed to trigger a sound on the YC versus the Legend, you're going to see a big difference here, and this just makes the Legend 1 action feel that much more like an actual Hammond organ. So with that new feature added and the proper octave width, I actually prefer playing organ pieces on the Legend 173 over the Yamaha YC-61, even with the piano-shaped keys. So the verdict on the action between these two keyboards. In my opinion, the action is far better on the Legend 1 for piano or electric piano, and pretty comparable for organ playing, with the Legend 1 having the advantage of true full-size keys and a higher trigger point, and the YC-61 having the advantage of waterfall-shaped keys, which are still a little bit smoother and more comfortable for palm smears. If you only wanted a keyboard for organ playing and you didn't care about the narrower octave width, then you might prefer the YC-61, but for an all-purpose stage keyboard, my opinion is the Legend 173 has a far better action. This is now my favorite piano organ compromise action that I've ever tried. So what about the 61 key Legend 1? Well, I can't fairly comment on that since I've never touched one myself, but I do know that it uses a Fatar TP80 waterfall keybed organ action, which is used in lots of organ-centric keyboards like the Nord Electro and various Hammond products. What I don't know for sure is whether it's semi-weighted or not. And the online specs on the Viscount Legend series have been a little inconsistent, so I don't know for sure if it's semi-weighted or not. I'm still seeing online specs at major retailers saying that the 73 key version is a waterfall keybed, and it's not. And since each manufacturer often has a slightly different implementation of this Fatar organ keybed, sometimes with stiffer, sometimes with lighter springs, I can't say for sure without having played one. That being said, however, I have always loved that action for playing organ, whether I've tried it in a Nord or a Hammond or anything else. So with that in mind, I think it's pretty safe to assume that I would prefer the 61 key Legend 1's key action over the Yamaha as well, especially for organ pieces just based on the full-size octave width combined with those waterfall keys. As to whether I would prefer the 61 key Legend 1 over the Yamaha for piano playing, I can't say that for sure without testing one myself because I don't know if it's semi-weighted or not, and the 61 key Legend 1 won't have the advantage over the YC for piano playing that the 73 key does from having a longer key length and better pivot point. Okay, the sound comparison. I'll start off comparing the organ engines. Right off the bat, though, I do need to mention that I am not claiming to be a Hammond organ expert. I am very much a beginner. I've never even played a real Hammond myself. My experience has included a lot of the clone wheel digital organs, though, including the Yamaha CK series, the Yamaha Reface YC, which is basically the same organ engine as the CK series, the Studio Logic Numa Compact 2X, the Hammond SK1, M Solo, and SK Pro, and now the Yamaha YC-61 and the Viscount Legend 1. So any opinions I give on the organ engine here are just going to be my personal preferences based on the keyboards I've reviewed. The Yamaha YC-61 offers 4 versions of Hammond organs, basically at different ages and levels of use. Then there's also a British, so a Vox, and an Italian, so Farfisa organs, as well as some sine wave organs. And it should be mentioned that the original Leslie simulation that came with the YC-61 wasn't considered to be very good, but it was significantly improved in a firmware update. Now, the Viscount Legend 1 is using an updated version of the organ engine found in their highly regarded Legend Soul series, so Yamaha has its work cut out for it in this comparison. The Legend 1 engine includes multiple different Hammond models. There's a 1938 B3, a 1955 C3, a 1967 B3, a 1936 BC, a 1956 B3, and a 1961 A100. For pipe organs, there's a Baroque pipe, Romantic pipe, and Symph pipe. And once again, for those 1960s transistor organ fans, there's a Farfisa and a Vox. So I will quickly demo all of the Hammond organs on both, but I will focus on the default Hammond organ model on each keyboard. And then I'll quickly demo the other organs. So plug in your headphones and let your ears be the judge. So what did you think? In my opinion, the organ sounds on the Yamaha YC-61 are good, but the Viscount Legend 1 organ engine, at least to me, seems to be in a totally different class and pretty much just sounds better to me than the Yamaha. The rotary speaker simulation in the Legend 1 definitely sounds noticeably better, and one thing that other reviewers have mentioned that I've definitely noticed myself is that the higher octaves on the Legend 1 aren't as shrill as what you get on a lot of other organ engines, and that's definitely the case when comparing it to the YC-61. There were songs I used to play with my band on the YC-61 where I actually needed to adjust my drawbar settings if I started soloing up a little bit too high in the octave range because of that exact issue. It started to get really shrill. I really do think that the Viscount Legend 1's organ engine is one of the best available, if not the best. I would put it up in the ranks with Hammond's latest engines, and while the organ engine on the YC-61 does still sound awesome, I would definitely put it a rung down on the ladder with competition from Nord and Roland. That being said, though, the YC-61 does still noticeably outperform what I would refer to as the next level down with keyboards like the Yamaha CK series or the Studio Logic Numa compact organ engines. Okay, so that's the organ engine. What about the other sounds? The YC-61 has 181 non-organ voices, and the Legend 1 has 119. For pianos, each keyboard does have a nice selection. The YC-61 has multiple variations with different effects and that type of thing applied. Of the CFX Grand, S700, C7, U1, CF3, and even a Hamburg Grand. The Legend 1 doesn't have quite as much of a selection, but does include variations of an American Grand, JP Stage, it's currently my favorite, probably because it sounds kind of Yamaha-ish, a German Grand, a Concert Grand, and there's also a house piano. The one thing I have to mention is that in my original review on the Viscount Legend 1, I described the pianos as being pretty good, but not having as much dynamic detail as the latest samples from Yamaha and Roland. But then in my video where I went through the first firmware and sound update for the Legend 1, I changed my opinion pretty significantly. One of the updates included in that was improved dynamics for the piano voices, and I definitely noticed that right away, and it was a significant improvement. As far as all the other voices go, the Yamaha does have a bigger selection, especially more of the obscure voices like horn sections and that type of thing. So let's check out some of the main non-organ voices on these two keyboards. So what did you think of the other voices? Coming into this review, from memory, I was actually expecting the YC-61 to win this category easily with better piano, electric piano, and other voices, and just the fact that it has more voices available. But I've got to admit, when I was editing the comparison video, I was a little bit surprised at how good the Legend 1's voices were. The YC-61 does have more piano options, and in my opinion, the main CFX Grand is slightly more detailed than the Legend 1's JP Stage, but it's not by anywhere near as big of a margin as I was expecting, especially after the firmware update where Viscount significantly improved the piano dynamics. And to be honest, something that really surprised me was I actually prefer the Legend 1's electric piano sounds, the Rhodes and the Wurlitzer, over the YC-61s, but that could just be personal preference and could also just be due to some slightly different effect settings built into the presets, but still it did surprise me. And while I didn't test tons of other sounds like horns and that type of thing, or guitars or whatever, those sounds on my Hammond SK Pro paled in comparison to Yamaha, but the Viscount ones are actually not bad at all. And also, just a side note from having owned and used both of these keyboards in a band setting, I do think that Viscount did a better job than Yamaha with their built-in presets or registrations. Maybe I'm wrong and I just haven't found as many that I like on the YC-61 as I have on the Legend, but I've been really happy with a lot of the Legend's built-in programs, and they just seem really easy to find. So my overall thoughts on the voices between these two keyboards, I think I can sum it up with the Legend 1 being a noticeable step up on the YC-61 when it comes to the organ engine. And as far as the other voices go, my personal preference for Rhodes and Wurlitzer does go to the Legend 1, and for pianos and everything else, I'll give the YC-61 the edge there, but it's really close. Okay, so on to the user interfaces. I said in my review on the Yamaha YC-61 that it had my favorite user interface ever, and up to that point it definitely did. And it is an awesome user interface. But the Viscount Legend 1's user interface is right up there with the YC-61. I'd basically have to call this a tie. They're both really good user interfaces. Each keyboard makes it super easy to quickly see what most of your important settings are just by glancing at the keyboard, and super easy to change important settings on the fly since both keyboards have lots of clearly marked dedicated controls. And each one has a couple of features that the other one doesn't. Okay, so first, the organ section. Each keyboard has a dedicated upper and lower manual capability where you can either split the keyboard into lower and upper, or you can assign one of those sections to an external MIDI controller. The Legend 1 does also add in a pedal section that the Yamaha YC-61 doesn't have, which is also assignable to a keyboard split or an external MIDI keyboard, or even an external set of MIDI organ pedals connected to a dedicated port on the Viscount. The Legend 1 also offers a dedicated set of drawbars for the upper and the lower sections, and even a set of 2 pedal drawbars. On the YC-61, there's a toggle button to go back and forth between the lower and the upper manual. Now, while the intended use for this button is what I just mentioned, to have separate drawbar settings for a lower and upper manual that you're playing at the same time with either a split or an external MIDI controller, there's actually another really cool use for this, and that is if you don't have your keyboard split, you can just use that button to quickly toggle back and forth between 2 totally different drawbar settings in a song. You could have one set up to be a simple background pad for verses or whatever, and then quickly flip to the other for solos or choruses, that type of thing. Now, while that is cool, the Legend 1 does also have an answer for this, which is actually even more versatile, because it offers the same quick change functionality using something built into their registration systems called memory. Being stage keyboards, both of these have full-featured registration systems built in. Yamaha calls theirs live sets and Viscount calls theirs programs. They both allow you to store setups and configurations of all your instruments and effects, etc., and they both work really well. But what the Legend 1 adds to that is their memory system. For each registration or program, you can set up 4 variations of that registration's voices with different settings that you can then quickly access using these 4 A, B, C, D buttons. So for example, you could have a variation here with different drawbar settings that you could turn on and off quickly, or you could also deactivate or activate any of the voices stored in the main program. For example, I've got one program set up where I've got a piano on the left with a whole bunch of reverb on it, and an organ on the right. But I've got a variation on that where the organ is turned off and voice 2 is a musette, gets turned on for a quick musette solo in the same song while my left hand is still playing piano. So all I have to do is press this button and I've got my musette and I've still got my piano down here. And then I can press it again to quickly go back to the organ. But that aside, back to the organ section of the user interface, a couple of things that I do prefer on the Viscount are the use of the more familiar knobs for things like selecting vibrato and chorus. You do that on the Yamaha with kind of a toggle button. And also having the percussion control buttons in the more familiar organ spot over on the right-hand side of the keyboard instead of on the left. Not a huge deal, but just a little more familiar for those that are used to playing a lot of organs. And the Legend 1 also has a couple of extra controls in the organ section for key, click, and crosstalk. Those are actually features I don't believe the YC-61 has. But the YC-61 does have a huge user interface advantage over the Legend 1, which you've probably already noticed, and that is these backlit drawbars. These are fantastic to have. When I load a registration, if I just switch to a different one here, you'll see the drawbars are going to light up with whatever the drawbar settings are for that registration, regardless of where the physical controls are, which is super cool. And you can even customize the light color as well. So that's super handy to have. And even without these awesome indicators, the YC-61 still has a big advantage with its menu screen. If I activate a second voice on the Yamaha, you can see the drawbars are also shown on the little menu screen here as well as with the lights. But if I throw a second voice on here, you can see the second voice pops up on the menu screen, but I can still see those drawbars. However, on the Legend 1, if I go to a registration that has just organ on it, I can see the drawbars now, but if I turn on a second voice, then I lose that drawbar display on that tiny screen. So there's actually no way to have two voices going on the Legend 1 and know what your drawbar settings were. I'd really like to see Viscount address this somehow in their next update. Now, as far as activating and setting up non-organ voices, both keyboards are super easy. Yamaha has toggle switches to do this, where you can turn voice A on, voice B on and off, etc. And with the Legend 1, you've just got buttons that do the same thing, where I turn voice A on, voice B on and off, etc. And they both make drilling down into voice categories to make selections nice and easy, with some, like there's a dial here on the Yamaha to choose between piano, electric piano, synth, and others. And on the Legend 1, there's actually knobs as well, only these actually have quite a bit more categories. You've got piano, electric piano, synth, strings, pad, and others, so that just makes it a little bit quicker and easier to drill down. And the other thing I also like a little bit better on the Legend 1 here is that you've got a dedicated set of controls for voice A and another dedicated set of controls for voice B. On the Yamaha, you've got a shared set of controls. So basically, if I want to choose voice B, for example, I can turn voice B on. There's this button here to go back and forth between voice A and voice B. So it's this button tells you what which voice these set of controls are working for. Now, both keyboards have a lot of effects available and really good effects sections, but the Legend 1 did a really cool job with implementing effects. The effects types are clearly labeled on this knob right here, so chorus, flanger, etc. So you can choose your effect category and then press it to drill down into presets for that type of effect by pushing on the knob. Whereas on the Yamaha, you've actually got to, if you turn an effect on, then you have to actually scroll through the effects and you just see these little abbreviations for them. You do see them in the menu screen, but it's just not quite as quick and easy to choose as it is on the Legend 1. And with respect to the effects, just on a side note, on the Legend 1, there's actually a tap button here. So if you've got any kind of an effect that uses some type of modulation and you want to try and match it to the BPM of a song, you can actually tap that BPM on this button and it'll set the modulation to match. So that's kind of cool. And one more thing with regard to effects and modifying sounds on the fly that the Legend 1 has going for it is you can actually use the drawbars to adjust different things for the non-organ sounds as well if you've got that turned on. And what they do is actually labeled along the bottom, so you can adjust things like attack, decay, brilliance, cutoff, that type of stuff, just by adjusting the sliders. So that's also super cool. Now, other than that, both keyboards also have super handy global sections with master EQ settings. They're over here on the Yamaha and then over here on the Legend 1. There's also a master volume, and each voice section on each keyboard does have its own relative volume, so it's super easy to quickly adjust those. One last thing to mention is that the Legend 1, like most stage keyboards, does have labels on the top of the panel indicating where the ports are on the back. These labels are surprisingly missing on the YC-61, which I've never really understood. One other thing that I do want to mention, though, with regard to those labels, and I don't know why this is, but I've owned lots of keyboards that do have these labels, and they always do help in finding ports. But I have never had a keyboard that's this easy to actually find a port and just physically, literally reach around looking at the label and actually plug something in without having to turn around and look at it. So not sure why it's so easy on this. It's just the way they designed it, I guess, but super cool and super handy. So the verdict on the user interfaces. To be honest, if it wasn't for the backlit drawbars on the Yamaha YC-61, I would say the Legend 1's user interface is actually a fair bit better. But those drawbar indicators are an amazing feature for an organ player, so I'm just going to call this a tie. Both user interfaces are awesome. Okay, connectivity. I'm going to give you the details in a second, but to sum it up, both of these keyboards have all the basic and usual stage keyboard connectivity most players are going to want and expect. But the Viscount does definitely beat out the YC-61 by adding some additional connectivity features, including a bunch that are kind of specific to playing Hammond organ. Here's the connectivity that's common to both keyboards. They both have proper AC power ports as opposed to using flimsier wall wart power adapters, which is awesome. They both have a headphone out port, although I should mention that it's on the front on the Legend 1, so that's kind of a bonus. They both have left and right line out ports for connecting to external audio equipment. They both have USB to device ports for connecting flash drives for backups and firmware updates. They both have USB to host ports for connecting to a computer, tablet, or phone. Note that they both send MIDI, and they both also have audio interfaces built in, but there's a big difference here in favor of the YC-61. The Yamaha audio interface sends audio in both directions, but the Legend 1 only sends audio into the keyboard. This is really strange to me. It's actually the first time I've ever seen this. So what this means is either keyboard can receive audio streamed into the keyboard, so you can use this keyboard's keys to trigger sounds on a MIDI application on a device, then have those sounds sent back to the keyboard without any lag, which is super cool. And you can also use this connection just as an alternative, as an audio in, to stream any audio from a device like backing tracks or whatever into the keyboard. But what the Yamaha can do and the Legend 1 cannot do is send the keyboard's audio to your device to include in a recording of some sort. So with the YC-61, you can connect the keyboard directly to a phone and use the phone's camera app to easily record a video using direct digital audio. Or you can send audio to an audio track in a DAW app on a device, but you can't do any of that with a Legend 1 without using an external audio interface like a Focusrite Scarlett or a UA Volt. And they both have 5-pin MIDI in and MIDI out ports to control or be controlled by other keyboards. Now let's get to some of the differences in connectivity. The YC-61 has 1/4 inch left and right audio in ports with a gain knob for streaming audio into the keyboard. This is actually really cool because if you have a second keyboard with its own sound engine, you could stream that keyboard's audio through the YC and then into a PA system and only need one connection on the external audio equipment or PA, which people working sound at bars or clubs are really going to appreciate. I should note that these ports are not adequate for connecting a mic, though. You're not going to get enough volume. For audio in on the Legend 1, you're limited to a 1/8 inch stereo audio in, which is intended to just stream in audio like backing tracks from a device like an iPad or phone or something. Now, both keyboards have dedicated sustain pedal ports, but then the pedal ports start to differ a bit. The YC-61 has an assignable foot switch port, which I use to control rotary speaker speed, and then 2 foot controller ports for other pedals. I connect an expression pedal to one of those to control organ volume. The Legend 1 has a 5-pin MIDI pedal input port. This is if you want to connect an actual set of MIDI organ pedals to the keyboard. Then there's a dedicated 1/4 inch rotary switch port for controlling the rotary speaker speed. And this is actually going to work with the onboard rotary speaker simulation as well as an actual rotary speaker if you have one connected. Then there's an assignable foot switch port and expression pedal port. I've got an expression pedal connected to that port for controlling organ volume. Then the Legend 1 has some additional connectivity not found on the Yamaha YC-61. It's got a dedicated rotary speaker port if you have an actual speaker you'd like to connect. It's also got additional outputs. It's got a 1/4 inch left and right auxiliary out as well as a 1/4 inch pedals out. These ports will bypass the master EQ settings in the main effects section and reverb, so you can send unaffected signals out. For example, you could send the pedal out to a subwoofer to enhance the low end. So while the Legend 1 does have some significant extra connectivity, unless you are a hardcore organ player who uses pedal units and an external rotary speaker, to be honest, I can do everything I need to just as easily on the YC-61 as I can on the Legend 1, so to me, they're not much different. For my personal use, I actually prefer the YC-61's connectivity because I can totally see myself using the YC's USB audio interface to make performance videos, as well as the left and right auxiliary in ports for connecting another keyboard and saving ports on a PA system. As far as the Legend 1's pedals and rotary speaker ports, I highly doubt that I'll ever own a real rotary speaker, and I can almost guarantee you I'll never be using an organ MIDI pedal unit personally. So as far as the connectivity goes, they both check all the basic stage keyboard connectivity boxes. As far as the differences go, which one is right for you really depends on your personal needs. Okay, on to some of the other stuff. Registrations. As I briefly mentioned in the user interface section, both keyboards have really nice, easy-to-use systems for storing your presets. Yamaha calls these live sets and Viscount calls them programs. With each keyboard, you can store your specific settings, voices, splits, effects, layers, etc. And they both do a good job, and they're both super easy to use. A couple of things to note, though. The YC-61 comes with 160 slots, but it ships with 144 built-in presets. Built-in presets are great to have, but that only leaves 16 available slots for your custom setups before you have to start overwriting some of the built-in ones. The Legend 1, however, comes with 396 programs and 220 built-in programs, so way more built-in programs to choose from, and also way more empty slots, 176, for your custom setups, so that's awesome. And the other thing to note with registrations is that memory feature that the Legend 1 has built into their programs that I went over in the user interface section. Remember, for each program, you can have 4 variations on the settings for your chosen instruments, so that's a huge feature. Okay, how about build quality? I'm going to call this a tie with both of these keyboards feeling very well built. They both use mostly metal in the construction, although the Legend 1 does have really nice wooden end caps, kind of in keeping with their organ history. And both keyboards' buttons, knobs, and controls feel very high quality and really sturdily put together. And the key actions, apart from how they play, both feel very high quality and solidly put together as well, which is no surprise given we're talking about Yamaha and a FITAR keybed. Now, I do have to say that I've owned tons of Yamahas, and they have always been very dependable and well built. But this is my first Viscount product, so how these two keyboards will hold up over time remains to be seen. But I'm pretty confident in both of them being just fine. As far as portability goes, while I know it's not really fair to compare a 73-key keyboard with a 61-key keyboard, the 73-key Legend is obviously bigger and quite a bit heavier at 25 pounds. But it should be noted that even the 61-key Legend 1 is also heavier at about 22 pounds, compared to the Yamaha YC-61, which is light as a feather at only 16 pounds. So the verdict. Well, in my opinion, if you are looking for a single-stage keyboard solution to meet both organ and piano, electric piano, and other voice needs, as much as I do like the Yamaha YC-61, I think the Legend 173, at about the same price at $2,000 US, just gives you a lot more for the money. You're getting more keys, you're getting a better key action for piano and electric piano that's pretty close to being as good for organ, especially given the proper width and less key travel for organ sounds. While the piano and other sounds might not be quite as good as they are on the Yamaha, they're pretty close in my opinion, especially for live use. To be honest, I used to own a Hammond SK Pro 73, which costs $3,000 US, and I much prefer the Viscount Legend 173 over the SK Pro pretty much in every category. If I was offered both of those for free, I would choose the Legend 1. So what if you're looking for just a stage organ for playing nothing but? Well, in that case, I would still recommend the Legend 1 over the Yamaha YC-61, but I'd recommend the 61-key version of the Legend 1 instead to get the FITAR TP80 organ waterfall key action. And yes, I would recommend that, even though I haven't actually played that version of the Legend 1 yet. I've never met a FITAR TP80 keybed that I didn't really like a lot. And with the 61-key version at $1,800 US, you're actually coming in a couple $100 cheaper than with the Yamaha YC-61. So are there any reasons that I would recommend the YC-61 over either one of the Viscount Legend ones? I think the only reasons would have to include things like if you are okay with a narrower keybed, if you really need the USB audio interface for recordings, if you really want maximum portability, Or maybe if you're using the keyboard for studio recordings for piano and you think you'd prefer Yamaha's non-organ sounds just a little bit more. Other than that, the only other thing I can think of is Yamaha's name and the fact that you might find it easier to get a Yamaha serviced if ever needed, and maybe resale value, but to be honest, that I'm not even sure about. So that's pretty much it for this video. I hope you found the content useful. If so, please feel free to smash the like button and subscribe to my channel. It does really help me out. I've left links below to my full reviews on the Yamaha YC-61 and the Viscount Legend 1, as well as links to check out current prices in your area, and as always, links to some online piano and keyboard training that's worked really well for me that I can highly recommend. So thanks again for stopping by. Happy stage keyboard shopping, and have an awesome day.